Hi there, my name is Cathy Herring, and I'm a life empowerment and mind shift coach. And I want to welcome you to another series, Unleash Your Potentials, discover how health and wellness can improve your confidence, increase your inner self-worth, improve relationships, and live that life you love. Our next guest has a very distinguished bio and history, so let me read that to you. Dr. Stephen W. Porges is a distinguished university scientist in Indiana University, where he's the founding director of Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. He is professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for the Psychophysiological Research and Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is a former recipient of a National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. In 1994, he proposed the polyvagal theory, a theory that links the evolution of the mammalian autonomic nervous system to the social behavior and emphasizes the importance of the physiological state in the expression of behavioral problems and psychiatric disorders. The theory is leading to innovative treatments based on insights into the mechanisms mediating symptoms observed in several behavioral, psychiatric, and physical disorders. He is also author of many books, including The Polyvagal Theory, and also he is the creator of the music-based intervention, The Safe and Sound Protocol, which currently is used by more than 1,400 therapists to improve spontaneous social engagement, to reduce hearing sensitivities, and to improve language processing and state regulation. Let's welcome Dr. Stephen Porges. Hello, Dr. Porges.
Hi, Cathy, and thank you for inviting me to participate in your summit.
We're glad that you're here. Well, we've got a wealth of information to cover today, Dr. Porges, and I wanted to start by explaining to our audience exactly what is the vagus nerve and what is its function.
Well, the vagus nerve, it literally connects our brain to our body, and its function is on two levels. One, it's actually a surveillance system that monitors all our major organs and sends that information to the brain. But it's also a motor system, so it can calm us down. The vagus, when it goes to the heart, basically slows our heart rate up and is the antidote to our sympathetic excitation. So if you get very anxious and you're highly mobilized and you do a little visualization or a little breathing, the information coming down through the vagus is what's calming you down. So the vagus is really, it's your colleague in regulating your physiological state. And if you have difficulties in regulating your physiological state, which actually is a substrate for many behavioral disorders, you'll have a defect or a deficit in how efficient the vagus can regulate.
Okay, I like that idea of explaining that it's our colleague in regulating our physiological state. So you are author and founder of the polyvagal theory. And so how does that relate to the vagus nerve, and how does that work for us?
Okay, well, polyvagal theory really is a innovative way of looking at the autonomic nervous system that is based upon the evolutionary history of vertebrates, really. We're mammals, we're vertebrates, but we have unique features of an autonomic nervous system. Our unique features are that vagus, that calming vagus that I discussed, is linked to the nerves that regulate your face, your voice, so your facial expression, your vocalizations, and even when you're able to listen to people or witness them, it changes your physiological state. So we have this linkage between face and heart, where our face is really conveying our physiological state to another. So it's even in our voice, but it's in our facial expression. We all know this intuitively because our nervous system evolved to detect these features. So it's less about what people say, it's more about how they say it, how they present themselves, how their intonation in their voice that enables you to calm down or to like them or come close to them. Because the history of mammals were that mammals evolved into a world that was extremely dangerous. It was dominated by large reptiles, and mammals were very small. But mammals had one advantage. They were able to communicate to each other when they were safe to come close to. So mammals became a species of cooperation. And humans, as mammals, have these features as well. We utilize vocalization and gestures to turn off our defenses so that we can be cooperative with one another. So polyvagal theory articulated that evolutionary aspect, but it also identified that we had two vagal systems, and that's why it was called polyvagal. And that we had this vagal system, which was all pro-social, calming, was basically our best friend, and it was to fight that mortal enemy, the sympathetic nervous system, when it became defensive. But in this dialectical model of a paired antagonistic systems of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, we lost sight of our evolutionary heritage, which was a much more ancient, earlier vagal circuit that we still have, but it primarily regulates the organs below our gut. This system, which is prominent in reptiles, while the one that connects face and heart isn't even available to reptiles, but this older system is really a system that when it becomes defensive, our bodies shut down. And what happens is that people dissociate, they pass out, they can defecate in the situation, they basically death feign. Their body goes into a state in which it appears to be immobile and dead. You can see this illustrated in a mouse when it's in the jaws of a cat. It's not an intention or voluntary behavior. So polyvagal theory emphasized that you had these three circuits, this ancient vagal circuit, which could be an immobilizing system, and that went back hundreds of millions of years. You had a sympathetic nervous system that came in after that promoted a system of mobilization as defense. So now you have shutting down as defense and mobilization as defense. But mammals had something quite remarkable. They had this new vagal circuit that harnessed both those other aspects of the autonomic nervous system with social behavior and social engagement. So we became a species of co-regulators and not a species of self-regulators. So what that really meant is that we could mobilize as long as we talked to each other, made facial expressions and social reference. It also meant that we could immobilize without passing out or death feigning. If we had gentle caresses or told we communicate to the other that we were safe and trusting. So we could have shared moments of intimacy, and we could have shared moments of exuberance through mobilization. So this newer vagal circuit is basically a coordinator. I use terms like it choreographs, but I also say it acts like a cheerleader as well. It basically is our programming system that says, I'm safe. Now I can recruit these different aspects of my autonomic nervous system to have fun, to play, to dance, to run, to do different types of sports. And I also have this other part of my autonomic nervous system which says it's safe to do nothing. It's safe to immobilize. I'm not going to be hurt. And what we see is this healthy type of individual where this part of my nervous system actually coordinates the different attributes and enables us to live healthy and happier lives. And the other part that's critical to this is when that new system isn't working, then our autonomic nervous system frequently goes into states of defense. And what that comes with that are a variety of physical health features that are also often correlate with mental health issues. So you have cardiovascular problems because your vascular system is now either mobilizing too much, but the most frequent one that people start reporting are gut problems, irritable bowel syndrome, and a variety of other symptoms that go with that, including terms like fibromyalgia, and where this older part of the autonomic nervous system has been recruited in defense. And now the body just goes there, and now you have what are considered medical problems because your normal homeostatic processes are compromised.
Okay. Very detailed explanation there. And as you were explaining things, I was thinking about maybe children in the school system.
Yeah.
Sometimes children come from adverse childhood places and or traumatic events in their life. And then, you know, they start school at 4, 5, 6 years old. And they may not be acclimated to what a safe environment is as what a classroom looks like. And could you speak into that?
Yeah. Well, actually, the classroom is probably not safe to them either, because the world is a world of threat. And just think about what education is about. Education is a metaphor for being evaluated. being evaluated is I'm in the state of defense. So it's not a warm, welcoming one as education or educational models like to think. It's all about saying you could be wrong or you could do something that's not appropriate. And so you have now children coming from environments where they don't have much experience with safety and trust. And now you bring them into an environment where the environment is defined by being vulnerable. And what you see are two features that come out all the time. One is aggressive behavior, which is the fight, flight, mobilization, oppositional behavior. But you also see difficulty in language development, difficulty in the ability to pay attention. And these are all profoundly related to the ability to regulate state. So if the body can't feel safe, and I'm not talking about taking in a sense, safety is not removing a threat. Safety is the promotion of other cues in the environment that enable our bodies to give up their defenses. I visualize a baby crying and the mother singing a lullaby or using a gentle voice with intonation, and the baby's body suddenly goes out of the muscle tension and the crying disappears. But think of that baby who's crying and what the father comes in. Many fathers aren't as skilled, and they end up, in a sense, using their voice and getting frustrated. And now, rather than giving cues of safety and trust, they're promoting or agitating the baby's defenses even more. And think now about the children that are coming from these environments where they don't even have a mental image of a safe environment. So the beauty of our complex human nervous system is that it works bottom up and top down. What it means is that you can have your body sending signals to your brain, but then you can have your brain creating personal narratives that reinterpret the signals that literally calm us down. And the example is that when people go into novel, frightening environments because they're uncertain, many of them have loving, supportive mental images to carry with them. And when you talk about kids coming from abusive environments, they don't have anything to bring with them, and they become vulnerable. And if the environment doesn't enable a trusting relationship to occur, they'll never succeed within that environment.
Okay, so Dr. Porges, that's profound. And I've worked with children in the school system, and sometimes I do. I'm not saying they all come from non-supportive homes. Sometimes they have very supportive homes, but something that has happened that they perceived as a trauma too. And so that might be a trigger for them.
Yeah, the point was when we start using supportive, we want to say you have supportive environments, and there are also some that are abusive, and they're literally, let's put them at polar ends of a continuum. Children coming from abusive ones, it's very difficult to work with. Children coming from supportive ones, even if the environment doesn't have all the resources, should do relatively well because they have those mental images to help them regulate their physiology. But the trauma, and this is why trauma, all these words become very ambiguous in describing individual situations. And even this emphasis on aversive childhood experiences, they become a checklist where people want to say, you had this event in your life. Polyvagal theory approaches it in a little different way. It says it's not the event, it's the individual's response. So we have to ask the different level question. We have to ask, how did the child feel in that setting? And we can't say, oh, that's nothing, because it would not have bothered me, or I went through something like that and it didn't bother me. That's irrelevant to the individual who's responding to it. So we have to change the way we get our information. We have to be much more respectful of the individual's feelings. And I started to kind of think about what is it that polyvagal theory brought to these various disciplines, whether it's education or the clinical sciences or clinical practices. And it was that it shifted what the human documentary really was. The human documentary was no longer a documentary of events, but a documentary of feelings. And so it was really an acknowledgement that we are organisms that feel, and these feelings are really reflections of our physiological state. And when we use the word reflections of our physiological state, we can deconstruct it and say they're reflections of the neural regulation of our autonomic nervous system. And if our autonomic nervous system is in states of defense, and this can be deconstructed easily and saying my heart rate's racing, my heart's pounding, I'm sweating, or I have these massive gut problems. I have to run to the bathroom, or urinating in I can't retain my physiology. These are actually signs and very powerful signals of our body telling us that it's in states of defense. So we have to honor those reactions. We have to be aware of it, and we have to offset those reactions through the only mechanisms that work, and that is cues of safety and trust. If we're going to shut down and pass out, the mechanism that keeps us out of that happens to be our own aggression, going into panic or mobilizing. So we see in many situations when we try to restrain, let's say a child is acting out and he's being restrained, that's probably the worst thing. I mean, there's a benefit. He might not hurt himself or hurt others, but that body is telling you that it's fearful of immobilizing, it's vulnerable. And this is the part we have to understand, that mobilization keeps us out of our vulnerability of stillness. And this is the other point, that we have to look at people, we have to look at the capacity of individuals to navigate on a continuum of accessibility and vulnerability. We all want people to be accessible, but in being accessible, you increase your vulnerability. And I have this metaphor, a question that I use, and that is, how do you deal with stillness? Do you like constant? So if you visualize stillness, is this pleasant or is it frightening? And those who have experienced it, let's say restraint or a shutting down, defensiveness, like the mouse and the cat of the jaw, stillness is threatening. It's life-threatening. It makes them feel they're going to die, fall into an abyss. So their body wants to mobilize. And what are the ways that we mobilize? We do high-risk behaviors. And that is that so that we don't sit still. Sitting still would be vulnerability. And you see this being acted out in classrooms. Often it's seen as hyperactivity or hypervigilance or agitation or oppositional behavior. And if you see it through the lens of the polyvagal theory, you see a physiology of an individual that's trying to stay alive. It's a quest, the organism's own quest for safety, but not in the way that we like safety to occur in our culture. We like safety to occur through appropriate co-regulation, where we look at someone, we interact with someone, and we share a moment together.
I see. That's very profound. And you and I have had another discussion about children in the classroom, and you had some ideas that you shared with me about maybe what a typical classroom ought to look like or be like. And I was wondering if you can recall those, if you could share with our audience some of your ideas on that.
Well, the interesting point is that when you have children who kind of act out, who are this hypervigilant or agitated in the classroom, the tendency is to put them in the front row. And in the nervous system is already telling you that they're defensive and hypervigilant. So the natural tendency of being in the physiological state that they are in is to be concerned about what's happening behind them. So if classrooms were designed as a semicircle against a wall, the body would relax. So if you sit against a wall or in the back row, you're not looking behind you, your body feels relaxed. And there are a lot of people who will be listening to this who live this in their everyday lives. When they go to restaurants, where do they sit? They sit in a booth with their back to a wall. If they go into places, they want to be in certain positions, because if they're not, they become hypervigilant. And what happens is they have difficulty understanding what people are saying. Because when we shift into a physiological state of defensiveness, the structures in our middle ear that enable us to extract human voice from background sound now work to pick up background sound, because background sound is where predators are. So we actually adaptively adjust to being more hypervigilant for predator and less available for language or social interaction. So we have to, in a sense, create our classroom environments to really optimize what our bodies can do, especially for these vulnerable children.
I see. Okay, that's really good to know. So besides trauma, who else can benefit from the polyvagal theory, the knowing how it works and the structure of what we can do differently?
Well, see, if you think of it as an intuitive theory, even though it's quite based in neurophysiology, that part of what I always like to say when people come up to me after a talk and say, I learned so much from your talk, I always like to say, you didn't learn anything. Be honest. All I did was give you a validation for your intuitions. So what polyvagal theory, it kind of explains to individuals why we feel uncomfortable in certain settings. So if you go up and you look at a person, say, hello, how are you? And the person turns away and you get a visceral reaction, you feel really crappy. There's a physiology to that because they violate a neural expectancy of the social engagement. So all these things become understandable about how we get disrupted. And when people are not reciprocal, don't follow through with their behaviors, then we react to it. So polyvagal theory explains what I call biological rudeness. It explains why we feel safe with some people or like to be around some people and not others. It explains to us why, if we watch children, why some children are marginalized on the playground, that people don't want to play with them. And part of it has to do with they're not interactive in the reciprocal way. And if you play with someone who's not interactive reciprocally, you'll get hurt. So there's another adaptive function where play is really complex because there's lots of movement, but there's also opportunities to be hurt, or there's vulnerabilities to be hurt. So polyvagal theory gives us kind of a roadmap of what it is to be a human being or what it is to be a mammal. And we can see it acted out in our interactions with our pets. It's really quite remarkable. We really play polyvagal theory on the pets all the time because we use a voice that is melodic. We make eye contact with them. We give them cues of safety continuously, especially if you had a dog and a stranger comes in, you always want to make sure that the dog feels safe with the stranger. It gets familiar with the gestures. This is all polyvagal theory. So, and then we also find out that if a dog was a rescue dog or an abandoned dog, they're skittish. They don't trust in the same way, or they're slow to trust. So they act out a lot of the behaviors that humans do. The difference is that we treat human beings as if all their behavior is intentional, as opposed to a lot of their behavior really being emergent properties of the physiological state they're in. And rather than, in a sense, use physiological state as explanation for everything, if we are getting into a state that we have aggressive emergent properties, we need to understand that state that we're getting into, and we need to learn how to navigate out of that state so that we become more pro-social. And there's certain tricks that people can do for themselves. They can breathe differently. They can take slow exhalations, deep belly breaths, and breathe out slowly, because that enables the vagus to work. But instead, what you see is when people get anxious, they change their breathing pattern to support the anxiety, which is longer inhalations and shorter exhalations. If they reverse that, they would calm down. But it's as if their body anticipates something, and now they're going to get that body really tuned into a fighting machine. And when they're in that state, they're not hearing, they're not witnessing, they're not listening, not interacting. They're missing all the cues of social interaction.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. They do that when they have the anxiety. Take in the longer breath and breathe out the shorter breath. That's good to know. So as you were discussing this, I was thinking, we've been talking about people are getting their cues from the facial expression, from their heart. What about energy? What about people who are really sensitive to energies? And
well, what they're picking up, which form of energies, with another person or in the environment? Tell me what you mean by that.
I'm thinking with another person. Some people are really intuitive with another person's energy.
Yeah, but what they're picking up really is anxiety, the motor tenseness. So people, we use term like tightly wrapped, where people's muscles are like that. All someone has to do is stand next to you like this, and you have no discussion with them anymore. And yes, it is their energy, but what is it that your body's detecting? What are the feature detectors? The feature detectors are that the exuberance in the upper part of the face is gone, the intonation of the voice is gone, and you're picking up all these other cues, and now what your body is saying is they're being aggressive. So your face drops, and you lose the warmth and the engagement, and they see your face, and now they say, why are you looking at me that way?
They do, don't they?
Yes, they do, because they don't see themselves as the initiator. So their body has gone into this state, and it really, at times, it shocks others, and they go like that. And then they say, look, you're mad at me. What, did you have a bad day? What did I, in a sense, saying they did nothing, but it's all you. Because when you get into states of defense, the narrative always shifts that way. And that's why the rule in life is to be aware when your body is going into physiological states of defense, meaning your autonomic nervous system is moving into defense. Acknowledge that, and then realize that that limits your ability to even detect cues of love and trust and caring and support of others, and learn how to regulate yourself in a bit. It may mean that if I'm shifting states, that I need to take myself into another room, into a quiet place, or I need to do a little bit of breathing. Or for many people, they do very well with their pets. They may need to sit with their dog. Dogs are less threatening to people who have difficulty in interacting with individuals. So if we move this even back into the classroom model, having pets in a classroom might be very, very helpful. More than, I mean, remember going to school, they would have a turtle or maybe a hamster, but what you need are mammals that are caring of humans. Dogs are amazingly caring of humans.
Okay, because I was thinking about, to think about us changing states, that, we can teach that to others. And I'm thinking the youngest people that come into the school system, it will take a while to teach them, but we can definitely teach it as we go along and teach it to adults. But what if somebody keeps going into a hyper-arousal state? What are some calming techniques for them? And this might be a segue into talking about your safe and sound protocol.
Okay, so the part that happens when someone gets highly activated and losing state control, the environments tend to say to the child or to the adult that you're doing this for a reason. In a sense, you better stop that. And it doesn't look at the individual as having a vulnerability and the ability to regulate their state. So all the cues, rather than diffusing it, ramp it up. That's why you have timeout rooms and other things, because no one knows really how to deal with it. And in a sense, they just yell at the kid, and the kid, hopefully over time, will become more available. But the issue is, let's start with your first point. Your first point is we can teach people to be more observant of their own bodily states. They can feel it. Everyone feels it. When people have severe trauma histories, there's a tendency of numbing. They don't feel their body. But through a little, feedback and support, people can be aware of when they go like this. They can be aware when their voice starts to change. They can be aware of their gut changing. And this is really the first part of it. The real important point is that we can become aware of our bodily feelings, but we are seldom aware of the cues in the environment that trigger those bodily feelings. And that is through a process that I labeled neuroception, because it's not perception. It's not that we're consciously aware of it. We react to it. It's as if that, like when someone beeps a horn when you're about to step off of a curb, you're not evaluating it, you're reacting to it. That's a neuroception. The nervous system has made a decision long before you're aware of what it is. And you can see the adaptive value for that. The adaptive value is if we start to evaluate every cue, the species wouldn't exist. We'd be in this internal, what I say is a Woody Allen argument of whether this is bad or not bad, and we wouldn't do anything. Our body reacts, and part of that we have to realize our body is reacting, and then we have to see what are the consequences of that reaction. That's where we have to become more aware. So the awareness of our bodily reactions are really part of this, and then also an awareness of how we can personally regulate this. Now, the segue into the safe and sound protocol was that over the decades, I was always wondering whether we could get into people's nervous systems through a stealth mechanism, because the issue is, can we present the cues in the environment that were cues of safety, and then the state would change, and then the individual would be spontaneously engaging with us. So if you're a teacher, wouldn't it be nice if the kid's physiological state calmed down and the kid spontaneously engaged to learn more or want to have more social behavior? If you're working in special needs, like with autistic kids, wouldn't it be nice if the child engaged you rather than using behavior modification techniques to reward the behaviors? Because using behavior mod for social behavior doesn't really work. You know, you get more behaviors, but they don't have the quality of the authenticity of the engagement. So I decided that I would create an acoustic stimulation that extracted the features of safety and trust from vocal music, going back to the mother's lullaby, and whether I could structure this music intervention as a neural exercise in which, over a period of 5 1-hour sessions, could I change the dynamic range of the acoustic features of prosodic, meaning intonation of voice that conveyed safety. And that's what the Safe and Sound Protocol does. And there now, it's actually close to 2,000 therapists have been treated with it, have been trained with this, and probably close to 10,000 people have been treated with it. And if we talk about children, the effects have been really very good. So what it does a few things. One, it reduces auditory hypersensitivity. So this is a high percentage of hit rate. So if an individual child has auditory hypersensitivities, a large percentage, I mean large, I'm talking about somewhere between 60 and 80% of them no longer have the auditory hypersensitivities after it. It also improves the ability to extract speech in background sound, so people are more tuned to the processing of speech. And it also, as a byproduct, it shifts autonomic state. It functions like an acoustic vagal nerve stimulation. It calms people down. And what you start seeing is some of the symptoms that were comorbid with ADHD or attentional issues such as constipation, diarrhea, irritable bowel issues disappear, because the autonomic nervous system now becomes more regulated in a more positive way.
Okay, so about after 5 sessions, it's more regulated and positive.
Right, and what happens, at least the whole theory and plan, was that it would only take 5 sessions because it was like a neural exercise building up this activity, and then the child would be more spontaneously engaging, and the social reinforcement from the environment would keep it going. I learned a lot, because when I was doing this with autistic children in certain environments, it worked like a charm. The effects got better and better and better and better. But then I did it in more challenged environments where there were single parents holding 2 jobs, and the effects were the same initially, but after 6 months it disappeared. And that was because the parents didn't have the resource to be reciprocal with the child, because a typically developing child is a demanding child. And if you're a single parent with 2 jobs, the best child for you is a child that sits in the corner and plays with a toy and doesn't have spontaneous interaction. So you have this dialectic. What do you buy when you have a typical child versus what you have when you have a child on spectrum? There's a give and take, and people are in that. And we talk one way about we want everyone to be, in a sense, engaging, but it's time demanding for people and they don't have that resource. So the one part that I missed in the discussion is that now people are using the Safe and Sound Protocol in the world of traumatology. And this has become an interesting sequence, because many people who have been traumatized, they were traumatized by those whom they had trusted. In fact, especially children. So there's been a violation, whether it's child abuse or even as people get older. It's usually a significant person in their life is the abuser. And what happens is that now, as adults, when people try to get close to them, they get defensive. They don't want to be hugged. In their mind, they would love a loving relationship. They want to be hugged. But if someone approaches them, their body knows their body's too smart. And so what Safe and Sound Protocol did for some of them they went through and they were really kind of like released and they really felt really good. But for others, they listened for a while and they felt really great. And then their bodies reacted and said, I'm not going there. I mean, not a consciousness bill. But so the trauma therapists are using it as a way of moving people in and out of state so that they can work on the traumas. And the beauty of the simplicity of the Safe and Sound Protocol in the world of trauma is that people can now experience those visceral states of either relaxing and feeling their body recoil. And so now it becomes a dynamic change that they're experiencing, and they can see what the cues are. And some people have developed they've modified the protocol and have done really remarkable things with the Safe and Sound Protocol in the world of traumatology. With children, it's been much more universally, I would say, a simpler model. And that is because most children will go in to see a therapist with a trusting parent, and they go into an environment with a trusting therapist. But if you're a trauma survivor, an adult, you go into the therapeutic setting by yourself, and you have to leave by yourself. So the hypervigilance comes right back on. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting dialectic that in watching that the culture of treating children is much more supportive and much more understanding about what humans need than the culture for treating adults who have trauma histories. They're basically on their own. And they need, again, significant others and support people near them through therapy.
Okay, that's good to know. I've lost my train of thought. I was thinking of the children, and I know what it was. It was the single parent environment.
Yeah.
Have you guys done any studies that if after they have done the Safe and Sound Protocol and can self-regulate, but they're not getting as much feedback and support from the single parent, do you go back in and do another Safe and Sound Protocol?
Okay, so what we're getting information from actually from the field and the people using it. And when I developed the protocol, initially was viewed as a single intervention. Mm-hmm. But with intuitive and sensitive therapists, they modify things. So I'm learning. And what many people do is repeated interventions every 6 weeks or every 2 months. Mm-hmm. And they're seeing gains each time. And when I was doing it, I did it as a research protocol, not as a clinical practice. And I was kind of locked to what I was doing with that. But we did notice that when kids got ill, so they had a head cold and the neural regulation of their muscles in the middle ear were no longer working, the symptoms would come back. And we also found out that if they came in for a couple hours, it was functionally retuned. It went right back. So the optimistic part is that if you can get this under control, then this becomes a tool that can be used repeated times at different intervals based upon how the child's doing.
Okay, that's good to know. So it definitely helps children self-regulate.
Yeah, the interesting project we're working on now is with a genetic disorder called Prader-Willi. And Prader-Willi syndrome is one of the features of that is they're coming to the world with a weak suck, swallow, and breathe, so their failure to thrive at birth. But then they become obese. They eat a lot, and it's being treated in the world of psychiatry as having an eating disorder component. But from polyvagal theory, the suck, swallow, breathe deficit tells you everything. It says that system is weak, and that's the same system that becomes our social engagement system. It's the same neural structures that give us facial expression, give us listening, and give us vocalization. And their voices lack prosody, like autistic kids. Their ability to extract human voice changes. And the eating is, again, an inefficient way of state regulation. What we find out with typical babies is that eating is a major state regulator early in life, but that gets displaced by social behavior around 6 months or a little bit older. So social, the mother's engagement becomes more important than shoving food in front of the baby. So the baby's nervous system wants the reciprocity. What we found out was that even with Prader-Willi, this really amazingly complicated disorder, the kids were expressing more exploratory behavior, more curiosity, and one child didn't even left food on his plate, which was unheard of within that group. So it was, in a sense, developing other pathways now of regulation. So what we're beginning to see with many types of disorders is that the disorder might not be changed, the core disorder may not be changed by SSP, but the ancillary components that are linked to autonomic function and social engagement may be in part reversible. And that's kind of thrilling. So you think that this disorder has this whole complex of the symptoms, but really a good portion of those are there's plasticity with them, there's flexibility.
Okay, that's good to know that we can address all of that. And so I would guess this would also work with addiction disorders.
Well, this is what we're starting. If you think of addiction as merely, I don't mean addiction as being something that's not amazingly difficult and complex, but the major core of addiction is state disorder. People are doing things to regulate how they feel. Now that puts it right into the world of polyvagal theory. But the strategies of the addictions are their routes of trying to regulate physiological state. So actually I've been involved with trying to develop pilot programs in a couple of addiction sites or sites that deal with addictions, where we give them breathing techniques, we give them biofeedback techniques, we give them the safe and sound protocol. We're giving them tools to regulate their physiology without having to either inhibit their own behavior, which is really what they're told to do, or to violate that inhibition and take drugs or other behaviors. So the idea is you can have a toolkit, and this is your toolkit, and you use it. And that's a lot better than just giving a pep talk and having group therapy. So I'm looking forward to doing more work in the area of addiction.
That's good to know. It sounds like overall this is going to help us with increasing our state regulating our state autonomic state, so that we are all more emotionally receptive and stable.
Right. So if we think about what is the real major problem in social interactions or our social communication or in our society, it's state regulation. Can we regulate our state? Can we optimize a state where we are more understanding, more available, more accessible to other people? Or does our physiological state shift into defense? And when we shift into defense, we don't have compassion, we don't have feelings for others. And that's not healthy for us or for the people who are on the other side of the table.
Definitely, it's not healthy for our communities.
Well,
you've provided us with a wealth of information today, and I am really glad that you have uncovered the polyvagal theory and a means to help us regulate our state through the safe and sound protocol. Is there anything else you've thought of that you'd like to add before we close today?
No, the only thing is that as I've been thinking, the real area where I think polyvagal theory will have tremendous positive impact is in education. So the things that you were talking about. And in fact, in about a week or two, I'm talking at it's a conference at Butler University on neuroscience and education. And it's all focused on polyvagal theory. And so I'm beginning to feel the pull. And there are now a couple books that people have written that are focused on classroom behavior. And one book is a little short book written by an English person involved in the school system in the UK. I don't know if it's England. And her name is Claire Wilson, and the book is called Grounded. And in this little book, she talks about teachers who, when they walk into classrooms, their classrooms can sometimes just become aggressive and kids will have tantrums, and that it's often related to whether the teacher had a good day at home. So the teacher is, in a sense, bringing with her this physiological state, this affect, and this is violating these kids' need for reciprocity in facial expression and feeling trust and love. And so there was this continuity that she describes in these little stories. It's really quite remarkable. And I'll tell you one other little story consistent with this. One child who had the SSP, this is now back in the United States, did very well on this. And 6 weeks later, or a few months later, the kid came back and did another 5 days. And at the end of the 5th day, the mother walks into the room and the kid goes into a tantrum. Now, the mother was, let's just say, very informed and very insightful. And she realized what had happened. She had been talking to medical staff and she was getting very upset. So she walked into the room. The kid, after the 5th hour of this stimulation, is now spontaneously engaging, and the mother's dissociative.
I see.
And now there's this frustration, there's this anger. I'm here, I want to be with you, and you're not here. And this is part of what the teacher and the student in the UK, it's the same thing. The kids are engaging, why aren't you here with me? And the body reacts in terror, especially with the mother, that the child is now reaching out for the mother and the mother's not there. She may be physically there, but she's not emotionally there. And so the mother actually acknowledges, and this was written up in a clinical report that I had the opportunity to read. So that was very, very useful for me to understand what's going on in the field.
Okay, so when the mother acknowledged what was happening, and she probably changed her physiological state, did the child calm down?
Yeah, well, this is what we learned about disruptions or ruptures and repairs. What is a repair in something that's been disrupted? The repair is an engagement. And when the engagement occurs, it triggers the reciprocal response, and then you have a repair.
Awesome. So people, adults, parents, teachers out there, I hope you've learned a lot. These are all little great tips we can use, and if we have some therapists who use the Safe and Sound protocol, we can hook up with them if we have children that need to practice and have a improved state regulation system. And Dr. Porges, do you have a free gift for our audience?
Yeah, I have 2 chapters from books that I have put together, 2 chapters that I wrote. One is a chapter called On the Neurobiology of Safety. It's in the introductory chapter of the Pocket Guide for the Polyvagal Theory. And the second chapter is a polyvagal primer, which is really the theory in basically an outlines form, and that's in a book called Clinical Applications of Polyvagal Theory, and I edited that with Deb Dana. That book is actually, I would say, very interesting because it has more than 20 authors who are therapists who have embedded polyvagal theory in what they do, and that was really a moment for me to feel validated and feel really good because they had taken the ideas and applied it in what they were doing, whether it was neonatology, psychiatry, nursing, even veterinary medicine, play therapy. These are therapists in all different disciplines, and it was just marvelous to see the creativity and the passion for using these ideas.
That's wonderful. That's just amazing. And yes, as I mentioned that to parents and teachers and adults, we can also, as you had mentioned earlier, there's different fields we can use this Safe and Sound protocol in, and it's going to be wonderful. So I've appreciated you here today. Thank you so much for sharing all your wonderful information. I'm sure the audience has many takeaways, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Cathy. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks. Audience, thank you for being with us today.